I'm going to walk you through how to perform quality assurance, quality control on the crowdsourcing land use points. We're going to do this using the QGIS software application. It's free to use. If you don't have it available on a local computer, you can go to qgis.org and download it for free. Once you have it installed, you'll be accessing a project file that I've put together for your use. So this is a new instance of QGIS. You can close the tips, and then when you come over here to, I have it as a recent file here, qc.qgis, it'll ask you for your username and password. This is the username and password that you use to access Sexton or databases on gis.rowan.edu. You can see we're pointed here to gis.rowan.edu. So you are actually going to be performing edits on the live database that runs the growth crowdsourcing application. Don't worry though, you're going to connect as a user that only has specific privileges to make only a selected set of changes. That's why I'll be logging in as Riser developer, and I'll put my password in. And what you'll see is that already two of the layers that didn't need to come from the database are in there, Natural 2012 from New Jersey's WMS service and the 2007 data as well. There's also an Urban 2007 layer, which is the land use land cover polygons from 2007. That's the black mask that you see on the application. And there are two other layers. There is a tile filter, which are the 5,000 foot square squares, so to speak, that we're using to perform the quality control, and a points layer. This points layer is the actual points that that are added to the database. Right now, you'll see that there are some holes in the tile filter layer. This is done because I have a filter set for any active tile must be true in order for it to be displayed as part of this layer. You can turn this off by hitting clear and then OK, and you'll see all of the tiles that are available. One of the functions that you're going to be performing is you're going to mark tiles as false if everything looks OK. Now, an active true tile means that people can put points into that area. You are going to use you are going to change these to false to essentially say that that area has all of the points that are needed. You're going to visually inspect each one of these squares to see if any additional points need to be located or if any of the existing points need to be marked as something worth deleting. You will go in there and mark it false, the tiles false, once they're done, and then they'll disappear from this map. They'll still be retained in the database. It's just that with them marked as false, it will prevent any other points from being added to the application. That includes points that you add through QGIS. So if you want to add points to any of these tiles, that tile needs to be marked as true first. It's not in the map, you won't be able to select it if this filter's on. So if you need to change a tile from false to true, you will need to clear this query builder here and have it go back. So I could do that right now. I could just cut this, hit OK. You'll see that all of New Jersey comes back, all 9,202 tiles. And if I put the filter back, you'll see we're down to 8,202 tiles. So you may notice in here there are a couple bands right in a row. I've been performing QA on some of these tiles, and I've just zoomed into an area and started moving tile by tile through. So let's zoom in here. Another thing to point out real quick, there's a field in the tile filter layer that is assigned. The field is called assigned. And what I've done is I've just populated the volunteers' names in here. So you have Shannon in the north, Connor in the central Jersey area, Katrina in south, and then Sarah in kind of the Gloucester County, Philadelphia suburbs. And I've done this because Shannon, you had the northern part of New Jersey for the farmland project. Connor, you had a lot of central Jersey. Katrina's probably familiar with South Jersey, and Sarah's from this region, so I gave her this region to do. You are not restricted to these areas, and you can change what's in the designated, or not designated, the assigned field. So that is something that you'll be able to update. So if you run out of tiles, you can start moving into another area. I just wanted you to have some regional areas of focus, so that way you don't inadvertently go and start to QA, QC the same tile as someone else. The upside is if two of you are working in the same area and you happen to put points in, the same controls that are in the application itself, whereas people cannot put points too close to one another and they have to be invalid tiles, still hold true for you when editing, because those are rules that are actually in the database, and I'll show you them at the end. So if you were to say both put points at the same place, one of you, whoever tries to put a point at the same house last, will get kicked back by the trigger function that's in the database that says points can't be located that close to one another. So I'm going to zoom in now. I'm just going to pick the end of this layer here. And you'll see once you zoom in, the points layer becomes active, as well as the Urban 2007 mask. So I'm going to pick this tile here. And the tile labels there are just the tile identifier, and the T is for true. So that way if you were to turn off the filter, you'd see some of them have an F underneath for the fact that they've been marked false. So I'm just picking this tile, for instance, here, and I'm going to turn on the 2012 imagery. And I can see that there are a few points located in the bottom right of this tile right here, but it doesn't look like there's much new development that isn't either masked out or has a point on it. There is something going on in this area down here, but it's pretty much just, that's looked like it might have been a house, but now that I've zoomed in, I can see that it's a tree. So I'm going to zoom back out. Now when you start the process of making these edits, what I suggest you do is that you open both your attribute table for the tile filter layer and make it pretty small. And I also suggest that you open up the points layer. Wow, that wasn't happy that I resized it. So now I'll open up the attributes for the points layer, and I'll make this small and leave it off of the bottom here as well. Now, for both of these layers, because again, they are live in the database, there are only certain fields that you can change. You will not be able to change the object ID or tile number field in the tile filter table. You can only change active and assigned. The same thing holds true for the points. You can't change the record ID, user ID, inserted time. You can only change the type field and the status field. I would strongly suggest to you that you don't attempt to make those changes, because the database ultimately will prevent you from doing any of those changes. QGIS might let you do it, but then when you go to commit the changes to the database, it may have a freak out and crash. It happened to me once or twice before, so I strongly suggest stick to editing the fields that you can edit. QGIS will let you change some things that ultimately will not then get recorded to the database. So for this E14B11 tile, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the selection tools in QGIS, and you'll see here there's a select single feature. So I will select, and I have to actually have tile filter selected on the left there to select it. You'll see it shows up in yellow. And down here I could do show selected values, and you'll see here that this is an active tile assigned to Connor. I can leave it assigned to Connor, but I'm going to go in here. Oh well, I've got to start editing first. You can start editing from within the attribute table, or here on a dedicated toolbar for editing purposes. So I'm going to click edit, and you'll see that the pencil is an icon next to tile filter. You edit tables independently of one another. It's a little different than SDE, where you kind of edit everything and it's in versions. You're doing changes directly to the database in this application. So once you make some changes and you go into current edits and do save for selected layers or save for all layers, that's when it actually commits your changes and closes your transaction. Think of your editing session as an actual database transaction, because that's what it is. You have a connection open to the database, and things are going on within that transaction. The key thing to remember is, if the transaction is open and you did not commit those changes by hitting save, and say the application crashes or something happens, those changes during that transaction that were not committed will not be saved to the database. So remember to save your changes quite often. So now that I have this editable, I could go in here and just change active to false. And you'll see now that once it is false, and I change this, I'll just change it to riser, I can now go up to tile filter and say save for my selected layer. And what should happen is the tile disappears, because now that it has a attribute value of false, you'll see it's not, it's filtered out by that query, so it disappears, and you can move on to the next one. So I'm going to move into here, and here's another one that looks pretty much done. Based on the 2012 imagery, I don't see much changes, at least when it was here. I don't see many changes on this image. So after a little bit of zooming around, I was able to find a tile that had some a considerable amount of things left unmapped. In this tile here, you can see that there are some residential units down here that were not mapped. They were under construction in 2007. And pretty much that's it for this tile. Now, I can't go and mark this tile false until I go in and add these points. If you have a considerable amount of housing points like this, you may want to actually go back to the web mapping application and put them in, because it's going to be much quicker than it will be here in QGIS, because the application was pretty much built to put these points in quickly. So I'm going to show you what it takes to put these points into the database this way. With this many housing units, I would again suggest to you go back to the application. It'll be much quicker. But for 1 or 2 or even 5, it's probably going to be quicker for you to just stay in QGIS. So I'm going to turn off editing on tile filter, and I'll start editing in points. You'll see here there's a add feature button. So when I go to add a feature, I can just simply click pretty much on the center point of that house, and it'll pop up a window. Now, in here, the record ID is, this is the actual database sequence saying to get the next value. Don't change it. It's just going to auto-populate with the next available integer value in that sequence. Type, however, these look like single-family houses. They're pretty dense. That's 1130. In the application, I have them spelled out as apartment complex, single-family unit, rural residential, commercial, and then other urban, 1700, and then 7500 as things under construction. These are all built and hopefully occupied at this point. We're going to plot them in as 1130. So I'll need to type in 1130, and I'm going to copy it because I have a feeling I'm going to be doing that an awful lot. Status is 0. Now, that's the default value, and that's the value that's been applied to every one of these points. When you add new points, their status is 0. If they are a point that should be deleted, you can change the status to -1. If they are a point that, like the ones I feel that we're going to find in Bergen County, where they are actually housing points, it's just that they're areas that are already, we know, are urbanized. Excuse me, it's worth keeping the point, but it's not a point that factors into our analysis. You might want to mark them as status 1, positive 1. A -1 will signify to me that that point is to be deleted, but you are not actually deleting anything from the points layer whatsoever. You don't have permission to delete from the points layer. We're keeping everything because we want to show here's everything that users have contributed. The only way we will have deleted records is if the user themselves goes back to the web application and says, I put this point in, I want to delete it. That's the only time we're actually deleting records out of the database, because I figured if people wanted to undo their own work, they'd be able to do that. For quality control purposes, we want to just be able to flag those, so we flag those as status -1. Leave it as 0. I strongly suggest you don't modify record ID, user ID, or inserted, because inserted will actually be the timestamp for now. I'm using a -1 to say that it's one of us performing quality control that added this point. So just leave that as a -1 to signify points that have been added through QGIS as part of this quality control process. like I said, if you wanted to actually boost your volunteerism numbers for the number of points, you can always hop back to the web mapping application and add the points that way. You may want to do that for properties this big, because it does become much more of a laborious process to do this for each one of these points, where the web mapping application can be pretty quick. And I am probably going to let one of you find this and do the rest of these points, because this is way too slow. But you can see now that I'm adding those points have been added there. I can go to current edits and say save for selected layer. That actually commits them to the database, so they will then show up live on the web application and then also get factored into the various reports that are run inside the database. So I'm going to stop editing here, and I'm going to leave this tile active. Normally after I'd add a few points and then mark it false as something that, you know, all the points are in there. I'm going to leave this one for one of you to find. And the upside is you can actually go in and put all the points in with the web application and then go and mark the tile false. If you're so inclined, you can also go into the web application again after you've marked it false and try to put in another point, and it won't let you. Those rules are actually enforced in the database. Okay, I've zoomed into an area that has a lot of points that have been mapped, but these points are they're valid in the sense that they're located on houses, but these are houses that we knew were mapped as part of the 2007 land use. You can see the black mask has covered the entire area, and looking at the 2007 imagery, you can see all of these houses existed. So these are points that are perhaps worth keeping, but they're really not points that we can include as part of our record of what new development has occurred between 2007 and 2012. So I want to go and mark all of these points as being invalid for this specific purpose. So I could do select features by rectangle, grab them all. And you'll see that they'll show up here in the attribute table. I have show selected features on, so I have just those, and they all have a status of 0. Now, if there was a point worth keeping, but keeping it in the database but not keeping it as part of the actual record, you can make it a non-zero value, a positive non-zero value, as a flag that it should be looked into later. If it's pretty clear that it's something that should be deleted because it's erroneous, it doesn't sit on a point, it's just a point out in the middle of a field per se or something like that, you can change the status to -1. Any non-zero positive integer is a flag for review later. Any -1 value in the status field will be automatically deleted later. We're not deleting points. The only time a person is able to delete a point out of this point table is if they're logged into the web application and they delete their own points. That's the only way that a point record gets deleted from this table. Essentially, that's to implement an undo functionality. What I'm going to do now is mark all of these. They seem to be centroids of housing units. It might be worth keeping them or having them later. So I can just change the status to +1 in this case. So if you click here on the attribute table, calculate a field, you can see here we want to leave only update selected features checked. We're going to update the status field. And down here in expression, you could just put in a number 1 and hit OK. And you'll see that they're changed here. Once I hit save, these records will be updated in the database, and I can stop editing. Now, right now, I don't have any symbology rules to tell me when the status of a point is something other than 0. You can go and change this however you like to set these point values to something different. That's entirely up to you. I figured it's easier to just stick with the same color and type values that you're familiar with from the crowdsourcing web application. So now that I've marked these points as a non-zero status, remember 0 as the status is something good. That's a valid point that we want to use as part of this project. If there were no other points in this tile and no points needed to be added, I'd then go and mark this tile false. Now, to show you what goes on in the background, we're going to go into PGAdmin. And what you'll see here, there are a whole bunch of tables that we have as part of this project. Right now we're looking at what's in the land use update database. And in the land use update database, there are two schemas that I created. One is GIS admin, owned by GIS admin, and the other one is web land use, owned by a web land use user. Now, the reason this is done is GIS admin are database tables that are going to be used as part of the research. It's different GIS data. Some of it you can see here. There's a tile filter table. There's an Urban 2007 table. We'll use these for performing other reporting functions. Down here under web land use, there's points, reports, sessions, and users. And those tables are entirely populated by the web mapping application. It's done this way, where we have two different schemas of tables with two different sets of owners. So that way, if someone were to compromise my web mapping application, they'd only be able to change those tables. They wouldn't be able to go in and change anything else in the database because the web land use user only has the ability to change those four tables you see there: points, reports, sessions, and users. You're in a special group. If you're a volunteer on this project, you are in a role called Land Use QC that actually has permissions to change things in the points table and change things in the tile filter table. So you've been giving specific permissions to go in and have some privileges on those tables. One other thing I wanted to show you is this QC ops table, which was actually up on the screen initially. If we just look at the last 100 rows in there, what this QC ops table does is every change that happens as part of quality control is actually recorded in the database. So these are the last few changes I did just now, setting the points to 1. So you can see here, each one of these numbers is a record that ties back into the database record ID for the points table. And then the status went from 0 to 1. The type did not change. It went from 1130 to 1130. We didn't change the user ID from 24 to 24. And we just pretty much left everything else as is. So this will continue to get populated as you go through and change any of these point values. The same thing holds true if we were to scroll back even further. We would see, I think I need to refresh, tile filter. So this was where I went in and changed some of these tiles, and if we actually scroll closer to now, there will be a tile filter change where I changed Hornibrook to riser and true to false. That was what I had changed earlier today in the recording. So don't worry about making any mistakes. Everything can be undone. You have a lot of privileges to undo things here in QGIS because you can do this rollback. That reverts all the changes that you had made to those database tables until the last time you hit save. So if you do make a mistake, you can always roll back, and even if you make a mistake that ends up getting committed to the database, we have a paper trail, essentially a digital paper trail of all the changes that were performed on this project. And to me, that's a key element of why we're doing it this way. So that way, ultimately, we can release all of the points and all of the QC operations and have a definitive list of all of the different volunteer interactions with this database. Because to me, it's not just about having land use metrics, but it's also, I think, a great way to show how people can come together and volunteer a little bit of their time to help perform, different land use research in New Jersey. This type of application could be used for many other things, hopefully, in the future. So having said that, if there are any questions on how to use QGIS, or if you encounter anything in the database that you'd like me to help you with, by all means, reach out and contact me. I can always look at the database independently of you. So if you have, a specific question about one of these things, you can send me the record ID and I can go and look it up, or the tile ID and I can go and look it up. And again, thank you very much for taking the time to spend on performing this quality control.